Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the issues of agriculture, oceans, and pollution. So agriculture causes a ton of conservation issues, but today I want to focus on the four main ones, and that's habitat destruction, monocultures, methane and other greenhouse gases, and pesticide use. So habitat destruction is a huge issue with agriculture. About one half of all land in the contiguous United States is used for cropland or pasture. And over time, farms have been established and consolidated, leaving less undisturbed habitat for species like grassland birds, for example. And biologists have expressed concern about the declining populations of grassland bird species, and the loss of habitat is generally cited as one of the main reasons for their decline. So, beginning in 1985, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Conservation Reserve Program converted about 7% of the cropland in the 48 contiguous states to grassland. And some anecdotal evidence by wildlife experts like the National Audubon Society suggest that conservation reserve programs have actually helped to reduce, stop, or even in some cases reverse the declines of some populations of grassland bird species. So it's actually been pretty successful. Um, Under the program, the government pays farmers to take certain agriculturally used croplands out of production, and they convert them to things like vegetative cover, like cultivated or native grasslands, wildlife and pollinator food, and shelter plantings to create windbreaks and shade trees. So a lot of different things they'll use them for, but it's all about bringing sort of the native environment back. And the purpose of the program is usually to actually reduce land erosion, which is a big issue. It's also used to improve water quality for people and also, of course, to affect wildlife benefits. But at the beginning of the program, choosing areas that could be used in the Conservation Reserve Program really prioritized the areas according to how they affected the erodibility of the soil. And then as the program expanded, it began to recognize other environmental and health issues and benefits. So things like improved habitat for grassland birds and even water quality. But information is needed on the values of public lands and the values they place on such benefits like this. So they need a lot of information before they can really decide which ones they're going to protect. Um, and then in 1990, there were revisions to the Conservation Reserve Program, and they introduced something called the Environmental Benefit Index, or the EBI. And this is a tool that they used to prioritize and kind of rank landowners and their land for whether or not they were eligible for the Conservation Reserve Program. So scores were based on the expected environmental benefits to like soil, resources, water quality, wildlife habitat, and then other resource concerns during the time that the land is going to be enrolled in the program. So each offer gets submitted and it gets assigned a point score based on its relative environmental benefits. And each offer is then compared nationally with other offers. And at the end of the sign up, offers are determined acceptable or they're rejected based on where they kind of rank in their environmental benefits and the score that they got. So this is something that a lot of farmers really want to participate in because they are literally getting paid to just set aside a couple fields. So it's a nice thing for them, and it's also good for the environment. Next, we have monocultures, and a monoculture is the practice of growing a single species in an area. And this is typically a practice in agriculture. This is a really big thing in agriculture. And whenever you look at fields on farms, they're typically made up of just one or maybe two species. This is an issue for a lot of reasons. So having the same species planted in the same place year after year leads to an increase in disease, an increase in pests and invasives. And because it's all one plant, pests and diseases are able to spread more quickly when there's an uninterrupted field of a resource that they're exploiting. In things like polycultures, which is multiple types of plants, um, where where there's a lot of different species, it kind of provides breaks in between each little patch of a certain species, and that acts as a barrier to these pests and diseases. So monocultures are very susceptible to issues like pests and diseases. And the reason monocultures are so common in agriculture, you would think they wouldn't be because, they have these negative effects too, but the reason they're so common is because they're so much easier. So it makes planting, maintenance, and harvesting a lot easier. So different species grow at different rates, right? They have different needs. With a monoculture, you can plant everything at once. You can treat everything exactly the same, and you can harvest everything at once. You don't need continuous different types of maintenance and different types of monitoring and harvesting at different times with monocultures. It's a lot simpler for farmers to deal with. And this isn't just a concept that is used with planting crops. It's not just about like what we eat. It's also been used with human-made forests, especially in areas that are intended for logging. So we'll often plant entire forests of one tree that's particularly sought after in the logging industry. And monocultures also, another of them, they limit the biodiversity of an area. You only have one species. So the only species that can survive there, other than that species that you have planted, are the ones that only need that specific monoculture species to survive. So you're not going to be able to have a very wide range of animal species that are able to be there, or even other plants that are able to grow near it. So you're really limiting yourself. And this isn't just an issue for wildlife, it's also an issue for the actual crops that they're growing. It's been a big problem with our production levels of certain types of crops. And we've already had some massive crop die-offs because of the use of monocultures. So, for example, in Ireland, exclusively one variety of potato called the lumper led to the Great Potato Famine of 1845 to 1849. So this type of potato, it was inexpensive. It was feeding the masses in Ireland, and they had little to no genetic variation in them. So when a fungus arrived in Ireland from the Americas, the lumper had no resistance to the disease. So it led to a complete failure of the potato crop across all of Ireland. Um, Another example is until the 1950s, we actually had one species of banana that represented almost all of the bananas that were consumed in the United States. People liked them because they had a good taste, they had very small seeds, and they were efficient to produce. And the small seeds, even though they were more appealing to eat when they're small, were not really suitable for planting. So what that meant is they actually had to take the banana plants and grow them from the cut root sprouts of another plant. And what that did is it resulted in kind of an asexual form of planting. So all of the bananas that were grown had identical genetic makeups, and that gave them no traits for resistance to diseases. So a fungal disease actually spread really quickly throughout the Caribbean where the bananas were being grown. And by the beginning of the 1960s, growers actually had to switch to a different species. Unfortunately, the different species is grown in a very similar manner, and now they're also at risk of disease as well. And there's a lot of more examples of this type of thing happening. This has happened a lot of different crops in a lot of different times. So it isn't just farmers that are guilty. Oh, too far. It isn't just farmers that are guilty of creating harmful monocultures. There's actually one type of monoculture that people never seem to think of, but it's probably the most common monoculture out there. and that's our lawns. These lawns that you see here in these pictures that you see whenever you're driving through suburbia, they're not natural. A lot of people kind of have the idea that green is healthy, so it's good, it's nature, but it isn't true when it comes to this. Manicured lawns make up over 50 million acres of land in the United States. And I'm sure many of us have lived in a house or somewhere where we have had these lawns. We've gone to parks where they have lawns like this where you can walk through. And it's not actually good for wildlife. They provide little to nothing to wildlife. And a lot of us, I'm sure, when we were younger or even now, go outside and we're told to pluck the weeds from the lawn. But a lot of these so-called weeds actually have more of a right to be there than the grass that you have planted in your own lawn. So this is like a cultivated grass that we're using. It's not a natural plant. Even worse, some people might use things like fertilizer or weed killer on their lawn to get rid of anything that's not that one species of grass. And those chemicals will even wash off of the lawn and into waterways. And they've poisoned water sources, they've poisoned birds, fish, wildlife. So they've caused a lot of issues other than just the plants in your lawn. And then there's the issue of water and fossil fuels that go into having one of these manicured lawns. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, estimates that about a third of all public water is used to water grass. And in the US, lawns consume nearly 9 billion gallons of water every day. So that's a ton of water. We also consume 200 million gallons of gas every year just for our lawnmowers and our weed whackers. And we use over 70 million pounds of pesticides on our lawns alone. So our lawns really, they provide virtually no habitat for native animals and plants. And there's really no benefit to having a manicured lawn other than the fact that some people like the way it looks. That's literally the only reason for it. So it's something that we've kind of perpetuated in our society, that you have to have a lawn that looks like this. You can live in certain neighborhoods and you'll have maybe a homeowners association who require you to have one of these lawns. And this is something that's become such a common thing, but there are ways to stray away from this and still have a nice yard. You can do things like this. A better alternative would be planting a native wildflower or pollinator garden in your backyard. And in my opinion, this is actually way more aesthetically pleasing. And it also provides benefits to wildlife. It requires a lot less maintenance than a normal lawn. You don't need to take as much time. You don't have to mow anything. You just let it grow. And plus you get to see native pollinators, birds, all different types of wildlife will come to your yard. To some people that might sound like a negative. Some people don't like animals in their yard. But I think I would love for that to be a thing in my yard. So you can do things like this, and there's all different types of ways you can set it up. It doesn't have to be just like a flower garden. You can do like this here. They have native mosses and trees. There's a lot of different ways to make your yard more environmentally friendly and still have it tailored to the things that you enjoy. So another big issue with agriculture is methane. So agriculture is a huge proponent in the creation of atmospheric methane. And in the US alone, we have 94.4 million cattle. That's just in this one country. Our livestock is constantly releasing methane gas. And methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than even CO2 is. And even though other types of livestock release methane, so poultry like chicken, swine, pigs, they release methane. Really, cattle are the main one that releases methane. So there is a ton of methane being released by each cow every year. So we have about 271 pounds of methane every year per cow. That is a ton. Another big issue in agriculture is the use of pesticides and how it affects wildlife. So, one really interesting example of how pesticides have affected wildlife are in birds of prey. So, birds of prey like the bald eagle and the osprey and the peregrine falcon were affected terribly by pesticides in the past. When populations of these and other raptors began to abruptly decline in the 1950s, there was concern for the birds' safety, and it prompted urgent research into the cause of what was making their populations decline. So the culprit was eventually identified as the chemical pesticide DDT. And it was also partially in relation to other organochlorine compounds like DDE and dieldrin, but DDT was the main one. So DDT was first used as an insecticide during World War II, and it was used to combat insect-borne diseases among the troops. But after the war ended, they started using it domestically, and the demand of it kind of exploded. They were using it to control agricultural pests and also for mosquitoes. But all of a sudden, the raptor populations plummeted. And raptors were particularly vulnerable to these compounds because of their position at the top of the food chain. So toxic chemicals became concentrated at the top of the food chain because of a phenomenon called biomagnification. And what this is pesticides are ingested and absorbed by insects and other invertebrates, and they remain in their tissues at fairly low concentrations. But then when fish, birds, and mammals eat a diet of these insects, the pesticide is further concentrated, and eventually it leads to higher toxic levels. So, for example, DDT concentrations might be like 0.000000003 parts per million in lake water. But then it might become 0.04 parts per million in the zooplankton in the lake. Then it might rise to 0.5 parts per million in the minnows that eat that zooplankton. And from there, it might rise to 2 parts per million in the fish that eat the minnows. And then for the fish-eating birds, like our raptors, like the eagle and the osprey, it might even rise to something like 25 parts per million. So as you go up the food chain, it's increasing in concentration. So birds like the osprey and the bald eagle are particularly susceptible because they rely heavily on fish. And the concentration of the toxins drained into rivers and lakes from agricultural watersheds was already pretty high. So as it made its way up the food chain, it was killing a lot of these birds. So DDT and its breakdown products also cause eggshell thinning in these birds. So even ones that weren't personally being killed from this DDT, they were laying eggs, and their eggs were so fragile that as they tried to incubate them, they actually ended up squishing some of the eggs and destroying them. So this led to extreme declines in their numbers. So what they did is they banned DDT and other organochlorine pesticides in 1972. And after that, they saw a massive increase in the population of raptors. So the peregrine falcon made an astonishing strong recovery in many parts of the world. Captive bred peregrine falcons were released within their former range, and they've even established new breeding populations. They actually will sometimes nest on like skyscrapers in urban areas. They like to be up high when they nest. They'll nest at the tops of mountains or again on skyscrapers. And then ospreys and bald eagles have made similar comebacks. There's now over 14,000 breeding pairs of bald eagles in the lower 48 states. And that's following a low of only 487 pairs in 1963 when all of this was happening. So the unanticipated decline of raptor populations really illustrates the dangers of indiscriminately introducing chemicals into the environment. So, the unique sensitivity of raptors to pesticides kind of warned us of the potential danger to humans as well. Um, it should have kind of been expected that a chemical toxic to insects might have negative impacts on other organisms, but it wasn't very tested back then. So, chemicals known to be toxic on human and animal life are still being produced today and finding their way into the environment. If you ever have the chance, you should read a book. It's called Silent Spring, and it's by a woman named Rachel Carson. It was published in 1962, and it actually documents the adverse effects in the environment caused by the use of pesticides. And it was really this book that brought the issues with pesticides to light, and it informed the general public about what was going on. And there's actually a couple of quotes that kind of sum up what she talks about in the book. So one of the quotes is, "A who's who of pesticides is therefore of concern to us all. If we're going to live so intimately with these chemicals, eating and drinking them, taking them into the very marrow of our bones, we had better know something about their nature and their power." So this comes into the play of how we didn't really know anything about the effects of DDT when we were using it, and we found out the hard way. She also said, "How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind?" So, again, we were using something we didn't know what it was going to do, and it ended up causing huge issues in the environment. And to some people, they're like, well, it's getting rid of the pests, but it also is a lot of our pesticides that we're using now, we don't really know how they're going to affect other species. There have been studies that have shown declines in a lot of types of birds due to certain pesticide types. And that's not to say that all pesticides necessarily cause issues in other species, but we need to do a lot more research in order to really understand how each one works. So I suggest at some point you read this book. It's not required for the class or anything, but at some point read it sometime in your life, and you'll get a pretty nice understanding of what kind of happened with the whole pesticide issue back in the 60s. So now all of this isn't to say that all farms and all plantations have to cause these issues. There are some farmers that are going above and beyond, not only to minimize their impact on the environment, but sometimes to actually provide extra benefits to the environment that wouldn't necessarily be there if this farm wasn't there. So just as an example, there's actually a coffee farm in Costa Rica I visited a few years ago, and it's called Cafe Cristina. They have like the best coffee you'll ever have in your life. I order it online now because I can't drink anything else. And instead of having a monoculture where there's just rows and rows of coffee plants, like a lot of coffee plantations have, they actually have coffee plants scattered throughout fields of native species. So they have an enormous variety of native plants and animals on the plantation. And they've actually been able to document 341 species of birds, like 250 species of butterflies, 30 species of reptiles and amphibians, 55 species of orchids, so all different types of biodiversity on their farm. And it's a really important site for neotropical migrants. So it's one of the few remaining habitats in the eastern central valley of Costa Rica. And because of this, it's actually so important that it's there. It's actually surrounded by urban areas, so it's kind of an island in a sea of unsuitable habitats. So it also works as a sort of stepping stone for many animals to get from suitable habitat to another. And unlike some farms that try to exclude insects and unwanted plants using chemicals, Cafe Cristina actually decided not to use any insecticides or pesticides or herbicides. And it actually benefits from these things by having this method. So not using any of this means there's more invertebrates. More invertebrates means there's more birds that can feed on these invertebrates. And there's also more small plants growing. And the small plants are allowing shade for some animals and areas for them to hide in or nest under. And having these birds here, some of them might eat some of the plants, but they're also gonna plant more plants by pooping out the seeds, right? So you're kind of just having a natural ecosystem going on right here. And they've even planted taller trees which act to shade the coffee plants, allowing them to grow better. A third of the farm has been set aside as a preserve and has been reforested with native species. And they've planted rescued epiphytes like orchids and bromeliads on the trunks of some of their trees to bring them back. Um, and all of these efforts have provided suitable habitat to a ton of species. So it just shows that it's possible to create a sustainable farm that actually benefits wildlife. And of course, this is just an example. They're not the only ones. There's a bunch of farms that are using similar practices. And these are the people that it's kind of important to support these businesses that are trying to do this, because they really are going above and beyond to make sure that they are limiting their impact on the environment as much as possible. So now we're going to get into oceans. And oceans arguably face the largest number of issues from human activities. We've already talked about a few of them, like overharvesting, bycatch, climate change, oil spills. But today we're going to talk about some of the other issues that oceans face. So we're going to talk about things like tourism, eutrophication, rising sea levels, acidification, and pollution. So ocean tourism makes more than $1 billion in the US every day. Probably not right now with COVID, but on a normal day. And it makes up about 50% of all of the tourism revenue in the country. And there's some countries where it makes up about 2/3 of their economy, in a lot of developing nations. Increased tourism is healthy for local economies. It's a great thing to bring money into a region, but it also brings increased negative impacts on the environment. So it increases sedimentation from land development. It increases sewage disposal. It increases garbage and littering. Tourist operators will often go to the same sites, so the best reef to show people, and they'll go to the same place over and over and over again, which eventually decreases the habitat quality. And it also leads to illegal fishing and coral harvesting. Activities like scuba diving, water skiing, and surfing have all become more popular in the last 50 years. And if they're improperly monitored, they are known to cause issues with ocean life. One particular event that made headlines in 2017 was the death of 2 baby dolphins in Argentina that were actually pulled out of the water and mobbed by tourists who were trying to take selfies. So a similar thing happened in Spain in the same year. Tourists passed around a baby dolphin for photos and it ended up dying from stress and dehydration. And these are just a couple of examples. There's been a ton of incidents where people have harmed wildlife in search of something like a good photo. It happens a lot, and it's kind of appalling when it does. And there was outrage when this happened. People were like very upset about it. It's not like it went like without any punishment or whatever. But the thing is, it does happen a lot of times, and there's so many people around when it happens that honestly the people don't really face any repercussions for it, other than being sad about killing a baby dolphin. Another thing that you probably never thought of as being harmful as in the tourism industry is seashell collecting. We have probably all walked down a beach at some point in our life, found a cool shell, picked it up, and kept it. I did it when I was younger. We've all done it. And in a study that was done, more than 30 years worth of this, there was a 30-year long study. They actually found that the removal of shells from beaches could damage ecosystems and endanger organisms that rely on those shells for their survival. And the removal is partially from us collecting shells. It's partially from collecting shells for retail sale. And it's also partially from the use of recreational vehicles, which are crushing shells as they drive on beaches. And researchers found that in areas that were common tourist sites, they actually saw a decline in shell abundance by about 60%. And seashells are an important part of an ecosystem. They provide materials for bird nests, home for attachment of algae and seagrass and sponges, and a host of other microorganisms. Fish use them to hide from predators. Hermit crabs use them as temporary shelters. So the removal of large shells and shell fragments has the potential to alter the rate of shoreline erosion and the ability of these species to survive on those beaches. So there's a lot more that comes into it rather than just, oh, I'm collecting a pretty shell. Those shells are supposed to be there and they actually have a purpose. Another huge impact on oceans and other waterways is eutrophication. And this is actually partially ties into the issues with agriculture as well. But eutrophication occurs when a body of water becomes too dense with minerals and nutrients. So there are these nutrients and minerals, and they are feeding on they are feeding algae. So there are algae in the water, they're eating these nutrients and minerals, and they actually end up growing very fast on the surface of the water. So you get these sort of layers of algae right on top of the water, which a lot of us have probably seen. You look in, even at the nature preserve, sometimes we'll see like the green gunk on top of all of the water. So this is algae that's growing. And when it grows too much, it actually covers the entire surface of the water, and it limits the amount of sunlight that can penetrate into the water. And eventually that lack of sunlight ends up killing plants that live in the water. And then the algal bloom dies eventually, because everything dies, and it sinks to the bottom of the water. And that gets eaten by bacteria. And these bacteria are using up all of the oxygen. So the oxygen levels decrease, and the extreme decrease in oxygen actually kills a lot of the larger organisms that live in the water, like fish and arthropods. So this is actually what causes a lot of those deadly algal blooms in the ocean as well. And a lot of times we'll see these excess nutrients that are coming into water as runoff. So a lot of times it's runoff of nitrate or phosphate, and it comes from fertilizers, detergents, sewage. So a lot of human impacts that are pushing these nutrients and these minerals into the water and causing all of this. Warming temperatures from global warming are also causing mountain glaciers to melt and the polar ice caps to shrink. And this process will continue to accelerate as time goes on. And that's especially because of, global warming. And as a result of the release of water from these ice caps and these glaciers, and also as a result of the expansion of ocean water as it increases in temperature, sea levels are currently rising at a rate of about 3 centimeters, just over an inch per decade. So by the year 2100, sea levels are predicted to rise by 40 to 60 centimeters, which is 16 to 24 inches, and possibly even as much as 3 feet or 100 centimeters. So these predictions are considered by a lot of scientists to even just be too conservative. They think that it might rise as much as 4 feet or 130 centimeters. So given such increases in sea level, we're going to see massive flooding of coastal cities, and communities are certainly going to be completely destroyed. Much of the current land area of low-lying countries like Bangladesh could be underwater within 100 years. Somewhere between 25 and 80% of coastal wetlands could be altered by rising sea levels and them becoming brackish by adding seawater into their fresh water. That would kill many of the animals that live there that rely on fresh water. Many coastal cities like Miami and New York are going to have to build expensive seawalls, otherwise they're going to be flooded by the rising seawaters. So there's evidence that this process has already begun. Sea levels have been already rising they've risen by about 20 centimeters or 8 inches over the last 100 years. And many low islands that were previously just above the water are now just below the water level. So sea level rise is also probably going to occur so rapidly that a lot of species won't be able to migrate quickly enough in order to adjust to the changing water levels. And the migration of species of coastal salt marshes in particular are going to be blocked where human settlements or roads and flood control barriers have been built. So not only are we causing these sea levels to rise, but we're also blocking species from being able to get away from it. Um, Another issue is the slow growing coral reefs. They're going to be unable to keep pace with the rise in sea level, and eventually it's going to be too deep for them to receive enough light to survive because they're actually really sensitive to the depth of the water that they're in and the amount of light that they receive. And since we're seeing water levels start to rise about 1 centimeter per year, that's about as fast as many of the coral species can even grow. So they aren't going to be able to outrun this or outgrow it. um, Abnormally high water temperature in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean in 1998 caused a lot of the coral animals to sicken and expel their symbiotic algae that would normally live inside the coral and provide them with essential carbohydrates. So this actually caused a lot of coral reefs to become bleached. And that's when corals suffer a massive dieback because of the release of this symbiotic organism that lives in them. So we're going to see that increase as well with the increase in temperature. So that's going to be spreading and happening in more areas. And when that happened, there was an estimated 70% coral mortality in the Indian Ocean reefs. So it was a massive die-off. Some of them have been able to recover in some places, but with the increase in the temperature in the ocean overall, especially in the shallow regions where a lot of the coral reefs are, or all the coral reefs are, it's gonna cause issues pretty quickly, and we might not be able to do anything to mitigate it. In the coastal waters off California, warm water southern species are actually increasing in abundance, while the cold water northern species that used to be there are declining. So we're seeing a shift in the types of species that are living places as well. And zooplankton are also declining in some areas because warmer seawater temperatures have dire consequences for marine animals that feed on them. Another byproduct of global warming is the acidification of the ocean. So because of our increase in atmospheric CO2, we're also seeing an increase in the amount of CO2 that's being absorbed by the ocean. So CO2 reacts with water molecules, producing carbonic acid, and it ends up lowering the ocean's pH. So since the start of the Industrial Revolution, the pH of the ocean's surface waters has dropped from 8.21 to 8.1. And this drop is what we call ocean acidification. And a drop in 0.1 might not seem like a lot, but the pH scale is logarithmic. So a 1 unit drop in pH means a 10-fold increase in acidity. And a change of 0.1 means there's roughly a 30% increase in acidity. So an increase in acidity can inhibit the ability of coral to deposit the calcium that they use to build their reef structure, and it will inhibit the ability of mollusks and other shell-forming species to form their shells. Ocean acidification will directly harm people too through its negative impacts on our commercially important shellfish species like shrimp and mussels and oysters and scallops, and the krill that are key elements in the ocean food chain. So here you can see a healthy ocean snail that has a semi-transparent shell with smoothly contoured ridges. But then when it's exposed to more acidic, corrosive waters, it becomes cloudy and kind of pockmarked with kinks and weak spots. And it actually is more susceptible to breakage and the animal dies, usually quite quickly. Sometimes it's so bad that they're unable to form their shells at all when they're developing. Ocean acidification could be a very huge problem if we aren't able to mitigate this. The next major topic that I want to talk about is pollution. While pollution is an issue in every ecosystem on Earth, it's particularly detrimental to oceans and other water habitats. Pollution is actually a threat to 90% of the endangered fishes and freshwater mussels in the United States. And water pollution has negative consequences for all species. It destroys important food sources and contaminates drinking water with chemicals. It can have immediate and long-term health effects on people and other species that come into contact with the polluted water. And in contrast to like garbage dumps on terrestrial environments, which are primarily localized effects, toxic wastes in aquatic environments diffuse over a wide area. So they're pretty much spreading throughout the ocean. And there's multiple types of pollution. Today we're going to talk about garbage, noise, thermal, sedimentation, and chemical pollution. We'll go into each one in a little bit of detail. The first type of pollution I want to talk about is garbage. Garbage can negatively impact wildlife that accidentally ingest it. It can strangle animals. It can be toxic to animals. It can also affect humans by tainting food supplies and decreasing even just the aesthetic value of nature. It's estimated that around 1.15 to 2.41 million tons of plastic enter the ocean each year from rivers. And more than half this plastic is less dense than the water, meaning it's not going to sink once it encounters the sea, but it's just going to float on top. So the stronger, more buoyant plastics kind of show resiliency in the marine environment and allows them to be transported over extended distances. They persist in the sea, on the sea surface, and they'll make their way offshore and be transported by currents. And finally, they'll accumulate in large patches. And animals get trapped in all of this while the trash is moving through the ocean. You can see, a little seahorse having to hang on to a cotton swab, a turtle who's had this around him for such a long time that his shell has actually formed with it. Birds often will die because they'll eat these small pieces of plastic that look like food and it'll kill them. And when these plastics go into the ocean and they all start to accumulate with the currents, we actually have something called plastic accumulation zones that are created. We actually have 5 major plastic accumulation zones in the world's oceans, and one massive accumulation of garbage in the ocean is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. This is the largest accumulation of ocean plastics in the entire world. It's found between California and Hawaii in the ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, and once these plastics enter the mass, they're unlikely to leave the area until they degrade into smaller microplastics. And that's under the effects of the sun and waves and marine life. But even these microplastics are an issue because animals are eating them and they are building up inside the animal and the animal dies. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch actually covers an area estimated to be about 1.6 million square kilometers. So it's an area twice the size of Texas. It's massive. And the mass of the plastic in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch was estimated to be close to 100,000 tons. A total of 1.8 trillion plastic pieces are estimated to be floating in the patch. And a plastic count that's equivalent to about 250 pieces of debris for every person in the world. Due to its size and color, a lot of animals confuse the plastic for food, so it's causing malnutrition. It also poses entanglement risks and threatens their overall behavior and health and existence. Studies have shown that about 700 species have encountered this marine debris, and 92% of those interactions are with plastic. 17% of the species affected by plastic are on the IUCN Red List of threatened species. So a lot of these species that we're trying to protect are being affected by this massive land of plastics that we have in the ocean. Floating at the surface is about 180 times more plastic than there is marine life. And animals migrating through or inhabiting the area are likely to consume the plastic in the patch. For example, sea turtles that were caught in fisheries operations within and around the patch can have up to 74% of their diets composed by ocean plastics. And again, this is affecting our health too. So once this plastic enters the marine food web, there's a possibility that it's going to contaminate the human food chain as well. Efforts to clean up and eradicate ocean plastic have also caused significant financial burdens for people. We talked about bioaccumulation with pesticides and raptors. Well, the same thing is happening with marine wildlife and this toxic trash. So the toxins are working their way up the food chain, and sometimes they're ending up in our own plates for dinner. Too far. So 46% of all plastics and trash in the ocean are actually fishing nets. And they can be dangerous for animals who swim into them or collide into them and can't extract themselves from the net. So when nets are lost or left in the ocean, we actually call them ghost nets, and that's because they are often relatively invisible to wildlife before they get caught in them. An interaction with these discarded nets often results in the death of marine life involved. There's been a ton of instances where dead marine life will wash up on the shore or even die in the ocean and we don't even see it, and they're just tangled in nets. Some animals will survive for a really long time with these nets around them if it's not inhibiting their ability to move as much, but eventually it will cut off the circulation and it'll actually strangle them. Another form of pollution that I want to talk about is noise pollution. So water is denser than air, and that means that noises are amplified and they travel further in water. To understand just how loud some of our human activities are, I have some examples of how many decibels different activities cause. A whisper is about 20 decibels. A conversation is 60. Busy traffic is 80. A jet plane from 100 feet away is 130 decibels. A 12-gauge shotgun is 165 decibels. And according to the World Health Organization, sounds less than 70 decibels aren't harmful to living organisms. But at 100 decibels, permanent damage is seen in 15 minutes. And at 115 decibels, permanent damage is seen in 30 seconds. So these large marine vessels that are in the water can actually routinely emit sounds that are in the 150 to 190 decibel range. So it's way above the threshold where it can cause permanent damage. And studies have shown that loud noises, even on land, can cause things like caterpillars' hearts to beat faster and bluebirds to have fewer chicks. And animals use sound for a variety of reasons, including to navigate, to find food, to attract mates, to avoid predators. Noise pollution makes it difficult for them to accomplish these tasks, which affects their ability to survive. So ships, oil drills, sonar devices, seismic tests, all of them have a huge impact on ocean wildlife. And whales and dolphins in particular are impacted by noise pollution. These marine mammals, they rely on echolocation a lot of the times to communicate and to navigate and to feed and find mates, and excess noise interferes with their ability to effectively echolocate. Some of the loudest underwater noises come from naval sonar devices. So sonar, like echolocation, works by sending pulses of sound down through the depths of the ocean to bounce off of an object and then return an echo to the ship. And that indicates the location of an object. Sonar sounds can be as loud as 235 decibels, and it can travel hundreds of miles underwater, and it's interfering with the whale's ability to use their echolocation. This is actually what's believed to be one of the main causes of beached whales, because they're getting confused by the echolocation or from the sonar. So a lot of them are ending up getting lost and getting beached on a beach. Another type of pollution that I want to talk about that actually hasn't been studied very much is thermal pollution. And thermal pollution occurs when human activity leads to a change in the temperature of a body of water. The primary source of thermal pollution comes from manufacturing and industrial plants. Many seaside and riverside factories will actually take in water from lakes or rivers or from the ocean, and they'll use it to cool their machinery. And then the heated water that they created is returned to the ocean or river. And in some cases, ambient water about 100 meters away from the shore can actually still have an increase of 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So warm temperatures can lead to a decrease in the dissolved oxygen levels because warm water can't hold as much oxygen as cold water. And a decrease in oxygen can suffocate wildlife that rely on the oxygen in the water. It also allows algae to flourish, which with eutrophication, like we already talked about, is how algal blooms can cause issues. The raised temperatures can also cause a thermal shock in organisms that live in nearby waters. So many organisms require specific temperatures, and any sudden changes in temperature can cause them to die. And some factories have begun to mitigate this issue. They've added things like cooling ponds or cooling towers where the water is able to return to its initial temperature before being released back into the ocean. So it's something that they are working to fix, and it's becoming less of an issue now, but it is still an issue and we still need more work on it. Eroding sediments from logged or farmed hillsides can also harm aquatic ecosystems. The sediment covers submerged plants, leaves, other green surfaces with a sort of muddy film that reduces the light availability, and it diminishes the rate of photosynthesis. And the increasing water turbidity results or reduces the depth at which photosynthesis can occur, and it prevents animal species from even seeing or feeding and living in the water. Sediment loads are particularly harmful to many coral species that require crystal clear water to survive. And we've all probably seen some rivers after a large storm that look like this one on the left. It turns very brown. It's full of sediment, and that's because the water is going up the banks and the soil is getting washed in. It's also moving faster and picking up some of the sediment on the bottom, and it's creating sedimentation. But it's not just from natural events like storms. A lot of this is happening from our practices as well. So in the ocean, it can happen from dragging nets on the bottom of the ocean. It kicks up sediment. It can happen just from our boats going by, especially in shallower water where the current is picking up sediment. So there's a lot of different ways that it can occur, and a lot of them have to do with our activities. When people think of pollution, they usually think of chemical pollution first. And chemical pollution can come from things like oil, metals, pesticides, greenhouse gases. And some of these things we've already gone over in class, so I'm only going to go over a couple of things that we missed. In the past, people assumed that the atmosphere was so vast that the materials that they released into the air would just be widely dispersed and their effects would be minimal. But today, several types of air pollution are so widespread that they damage whole ecosystems. And these same pollutants also have severe impacts on human health. So it's demonstrating again the common interest shared by people and nature. And the effects of air pollution on forest communities have been intensively studied because of the great economic values of forest for wood production and for protection of water supplies and recreation. So in certain areas of the world, particularly Northern Europe and Eastern North America, air pollution damages and weakens a lot of different tree species and makes them more susceptible to attacks by things like insects and fungi and disease. And when the trees die, many of the other species in a forest also become locally extinct. So it's a kind of a cascade of events here. Even when the ecosystems aren't destroyed by air pollution, species composition can be altered. More susceptible species can be eliminated. So we talked about indicator species like lichens. Lichens are symbiotic organisms composed of fungi and algae that can survive in some of the harshest natural environments, but they're particularly susceptible to air pollution. And because each lichen species has a distinct level of tolerance of air pollution, the composition of a lichen community can actually be used as a biological indicator of the level of air pollution that is occurring in the area. So that's why we talked about them being an indicator species, because they can indicate the level of air pollution that is in the area, depending on the species that are surviving there. Another type of chemical pollution that's pretty common, particularly in areas with dense human populations, is smog. And smog is considered a mix between smoke and fog. That's what people say. That's where the name came from. But automobiles, power plants, and industrial activities release hydrocarbons and nitrogen oxide as waste products. And in the presence of sunlight, the chemicals kind of react with the atmosphere to produce ozone and other secondary chemicals. And collectively, we call them photochemical smog. Although the ozone in the uppermost atmosphere is important for filtering out ultraviolet radiation, high concentrations of ozone at ground level are damaging to plant tissues and makes them brittle. It also harms biological communities and reduces agriculture productivity. Ozone and smog are detrimental to people and animals when it's inhaled. So both people and biological communities would really benefit from air pollution controls. And smog can be so severe that people might even avoid going outside and doing outdoor activities in areas where it's strong. This is becoming a more severe problem in places like China and India, where populations are so dense. So you're just having that much more output because there's just that much more people. Acid rain is also produced from our pollution. So it's produced when industries like smelting operations and coal and oil fired power plants release huge quantities of nitrogen and sulfur oxides into the air, and where those chemicals combine with the moisture in the atmosphere, and then they produced nitric and sulfuric acids. And these acids become a part of a cloud system, and they dramatically lower the pH of rainwater. And that leads to the weakening and deaths of trees over wide areas. It also lowers the pH of soil moisture and water bodies, it's like ponds and lakes. And it increases the concentration of some toxic metals like aluminum. So acid rain is currently a severe problem in Eastern North America and Central Europe, and also some other parts of Europe. And in the United States alone, about 27 million metric tons of these compounds are released into the atmosphere every year. And a lot of the deposition of this acid rain is in the northeastern United States. So increased acidity alone damages many plant and animal species, and the acidity of water bodies increases, which many fish will either fail to spawn or die outright. And both increased acidity and water pollution are contributing factors to the decline of a lot of amphibian species around the world. Most amphibian species depend on bodies of water at least part of their life cycle. And a decline in the pH of water causes a corresponding increase in the mortality of eggs and young animals. So again, this is another indicator species, right? And it's indicating the health and the pH of the water that they're in. Acidity also inhibits the microbial process of decomposition, which lowers the rate of mineral cycling and ecosystem productivity. So many ponds and lakes in industrialized areas have lost large portions of their animal communities as a result of acid rain. And while the acidity of rain is decreasing in a lot of areas because we are having better pollution control, it still remains a really serious problem. One final thing that I want to talk about is toxic metals and how they're also another huge cause of pollution. So leaded gasoline, which is still used in a lot of developing countries despite its clear danger to human health, as well as mining and smelting operations and coal burned for heat and power and other industrial activities, release large quantities of lead, zinc, mercury, and other toxic metals into the atmosphere. And these compounds are directly poisonous to plant and animal life and can cause permanent injury to children. The effects of these toxic metals are particularly evident in areas surrounding large smelting operations where life has been destroyed for miles around. And heavy metals become toxic when they're not metabolized by the body and they end up accumulating in the soft tissues. And this has been particularly an issue in bottom-dwelling fish that are consuming mercury that's sunk to the bottom of water. And fortunately, we eat a lot of these fish, so it's also become an issue for our health. And enforcement of local and national policies and regulations may sometimes reduce levels of pollution, and that's a big help. But we've also, in a lot of developed countries, eliminated lead from our gasoline. So when you go get gas, it always says like unleaded. We have eliminated the lead in our gasoline, and that's been a really big help for this. However, it is still being used in a lot of developing countries. So that's it for today's lecture. I will have the next one up in a couple of hours, and that will be your last lecture for the semester. So have a good week.